The wind was a raw, thin thing, smelling of snow and distance. It tore at the scraps of white silk clinging to Lydia's hair, whipping the veil across her face like a wet cloth. Each gust threatened to push her from the saddle. The horse beneath her, a big roan stolen from her husband's own corral, was lathered and blowing hard, its breath pluming in the cold Montana dusk. Her leg was on fire. She had fallen twice in the mad scramble to get away, the second time catching her ankle on a twist of barbed wire left to rust in the prairie grass. Blood, warm and sticky, had soaked through her stocking and now felt like it was freezing to the stirrup leather. This was a land that did not care for human trouble. It was too big, too empty. The plains rolled on into a bruised purple horizon, a sea of dead grass and sagebrush already heavy with patches of early snow. The sun was gone, leaving only a streak of angry orange that the gathering storm clouds were swallowing whole. Far off, a wolf cried, the sound so lonely it felt like a knife turning in her gut. Lydia pulled the collar of her thin traveling coat tighter. It was not enough. The cold was a physical weight, pressing into her bones. She was running from a man who owned everything in their valley. Clive Mercer, a man twice her age, with hands like cured leather and eyes the color of a frozen pond. Her father, drowning in whiskey debts, had called it a good match. He had called it security. Lydia, standing at the altar in this very dress, had felt the cold metal of the ring slide onto her finger and known it was not a wedding, but a burial. The resolve that had pushed her out the window of her new home, that had given her strength to saddle the horse and ride, was beginning to curdle into simple, animal terror. He would send men. He would not abide the humiliation. He would hunt her down, and the men he sent would not be kind. They would drag her back, and the word wife would become a sentence worse than any prison. The roan stumbled, catching itself with a grunt. It was spent. "Just a little more," she whispered, her voice snatched away by the wind. "Please, God, just a little more." It was then she saw it. Not a light, but a darker shape moving against the dark land. A smudge of motion on the faint track that passed for a road. A stagecoach. Hope was so sharp it hurt. She kicked the roan, wincing as the movement pulled at her raw ankle, and angled the horse toward the road. She waved her arms, the tattered veil flapping like a broken wing. The coach, a heavy mud wagon, did not stop, but it slowed. The driver, a shape huddled in oiled canvas, shouted something she could not hear. A man riding shotgun lifted his rifle, pointing it at her. "Please," she screamed, the word tearing her throat. "I am hurt, please." The guard held his aim, but the driver must have seen the dress, the blood, the desperation. The brake groaned, and the heavy wheels slowed to a halt. "What in blazes?" the driver spat, leaning down. His face was hidden by a beard and a low-brimmed hat. My horse gave out. I fell. Please, I have money for passage to Helena." It was a lie. She had only the locket around her neck. The shotgun guard looked her up and down, his eyes lingering. "Looks like a runaway bride to me. Jeb." "A paying one, maybe." Jeb grunted. "Get in. We ain't waiting for the storm." The door was thrown open from the inside. A hand, soft and smelling of lavender, reached out. "Quickly, child." Lydia practically fell from the horse, her injured leg buckling. She slapped the roan's rump. "Go," she whispered. The horse, freed of her weight, turned and limped away into the gloom. She was hauled inside by a stern-looking woman in black bombazine. The coach smelled of wet wool, stale tobacco, and the faint, sweet scent of lavender. Across from her sat a drummer, a slick-looking man in a checked suit, and next to him, a miner, his face ingrained with dirt, who was already half asleep. "Running from the altar, dearie?" the woman asked, her voice not unkind, but sharp. Yes, please do not ask me more." The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, merely nodded, her lips pursing. It is a hard world for a woman alone, a harder one for a woman who runs. The coach lurched forward, settling into a bone-jarring rhythm. For a few minutes, Lydia allowed herself to breathe. She was moving. She was hidden. The drone of the wheels, the rhythmic creak of the leather braces, the smell of the other passengers. It was a fragile bubble of safety. She leaned her head against the rough canvas wall, the terror easing just enough to let the exhaustion roll in. She closed her eyes, and Clive Mercer's face was there waiting for her, his thick fingers on her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You are mine, Lydia. You are property, like my cattle, like my land." She flinched, her eyes flying open. The drummer was watching her. She turned her head and stared out the small window, watching the snow begin to fall, thick and fast. The night outside was complete when the world exploded. The first sound was a rifle shot, close, and the thwack of lead hitting the coach box. The driver screamed, a high, thin sound. The coach slewed sideways, a wheel catching on a rock, and then it was tipping, and falling. Lydia was thrown against the drummer. "Who cursed? Misses!" Gable shrieked. The heavy wagon crashed onto its side with a sound of splintering wood and tortured metal. Glass shattered. The horses screamed, a terrible panicked sound that was cut short by more gunfire. Darkness, silence, then men shouting. "Get the box. Check the passengers. Might be something pretty." Lydia lay in a heap with the others. The miner was groaning. The drummer was silent. Misses. Gable was praying, her voice a frantic, low whisper. "Be quiet," Lydia hissed, her own voice shaking. She fumbled at her neck, her fingers finding the small, oval locket. She clicked it open, though she could not see the miniature portrait of her mother inside. She just held it, the cold metal biting into her palm. It was all she had left of a life before this, a life of softness, of books and a small garden in Ohio, a life before her father's ruin and Clive Mercer's purchase. She wriggled deeper into the wreckage, pushing herself under the splintered remains of a seat. The smell of gunpowder was thick. She could hear the heavy, crunching steps of men in the new snow. "This one's dead," a voice said, just outside. "Driver and guard both. Get the strongbox and check the insides." A lantern beam cut through the dark. Lydia squeezed her eyes shut. She heard the miner groan again, followed by a grunt and a heavy thud. "This one's breathing," a new voice said, rough and amused. "Well, drag her out. We ain't got all night." A hand grabbed Mrs. Gable's arm. The woman screamed as she was pulled from the wreckage. "No, please, I have nothing." Lydia held her breath, praying they would not see her. She tried to make herself smaller, pressing against the cold, wet earth. Then the lantern light found her. A face appeared in the opening, bearded and foul-smelling. The man grinned, showing broken yellow teeth. "Well, looky here, we missed one, and a pretty one, too." He reached in, his gloved hand grabbing a fistful of her hair. Lydia screamed and kicked, but he was too strong. He dragged her out of the wreck, pulling her across the snow-covered ground, the silk of her wedding dress, already torn, ripped further. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, clawing at his face. He laughed and backhanded her, the blow sending her sprawling onto her back. The world spun. He stood over her, the lantern light turning him into a dark, hulking shape. "Feisty, I like that." He began to unbuckle his belt. Lydia scrambled backward, her hands digging into the snow and rock. "No, please!" The man lunged for her. A single rifle shot cracked through the night. It was heavier than the pistols the outlaws had used, a deep boom that echoed off the prairie. The man above Lydia grunted, a sound of profound surprise. He stiffened, a dark stain spread across the front of his shirt. He looked down, as if confused, then pitched forward, landing in the snow beside her. Lydia stared, uncomprehending. "Stay down," a voice commanded. It was low, calm, and came from the darkness beyond the lantern light. Another outlaw, the one who had been rummaging through the luggage, spun around, lifting his pistol. "Who's there?" Another boom from the darkness. The second man fell without a sound. There was a third, the one who had pulled Mrs. Gable out. He grabbed the woman, using her as a shield. "Show yourself, or the woman gets it." Silence. The wind howled, whipping snow into Lydia's face. Mrs. Gable was sobbing. "Let her go," the voice said. It was closer now. "Go to hell," the outlaw yelled, his voice cracking. He pressed the pistol to Mrs. Gable's head. The shadow moved. It was not a man, at first, but just a deepening of the night. He emerged from the snowy gloom, a tall figure in a long, oiled duster. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace into the edge of the lantern light. The outlaw stared. "Crow! Jesus God, it's Crow!" The name meant nothing to Lydia, but it meant everything to the outlaw. His hand trembled. The man called Crow stopped about 20 yards away. He was holding a rifle, a big Sharps, holding it loosely at his side. I said, "Let her go." "I'll kill her. I swear I will." "No, you will not," Crow said. His voice was flat. "You'll shoot, you'll miss, and then I'll kill you. Or you'll drop the gun and ride out. Your choice." For a terrible second, nobody moved. The outlaw, his face pale with sweat despite the cold, shoved Mrs. Gable forward and fired his pistol. The shot went wide. Crow did not even seem to aim. The rifle came up, fired, and was lowered in a single, fluid motion. The outlaw crumpled. Mrs. Gable stood frozen for a moment, then collapsed into the snow, weeping. Lydia pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her entire body was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. The man, Elias Crow, walked forward. He did not look at Mrs. Gable. He did not look at Lydia. He moved with a kind of weary precision, checking each of the fallen bandits. He kicked the pistol away from the first one's hand, then did the same to the other two. He was tall, broader than she had first thought, and he moved with a disturbing grace. The lantern light caught his face. One side was marked by a puckered, faded scar that ran from his temple down to his jaw, pulling at the corner of his eye. His skin was darker than hers, his hair black and straight. He looked, she thought, like the pictures of the Cheyenne warriors she had seen in dime novels. But his eyes were not a warrior's. They were cold, gray, and held an exhaustion so deep it looked like a sickness. He finally turned his gaze to her. He took in the torn dress, the blood on her leg, the way she was shaking. Lydia's terror, which had focused on the bandits, simply transferred to him. He was another man, a bigger man, and a man who had just killed 3 others as easily as breathing. He was a pursuer. He had to be. "Did he send you?" she whispered, her voice raw. "Did Mercer send you?" Elias Crow's expression did not change. He did not seem to recognize the name. He looked at the dead men, then back at her. "They are dead. You are not." He turned, as if to walk away. "Wait!" Lydia cried, stumbling to her feet. "Where are you going?" "Away from here. The wolves will be here soon. You should be, too." You cannot just leave us!" Mrs. Gable had managed to get to her knees, her face a mask of shock. Elias Crow paused. He looked at the sky, then at the 2 women. He seemed irritated, burdened by their very existence. "The coach is wrecked. The horses are dead or gone. The settlement is 2 days' walk. You will freeze before morning." This was a pursuer. This was a man Clive would send, cold, efficient. He was just toying with her. "Stay away from me," Lydia said, her voice rising. She grabbed the only thing near her, a sharp-edged rock half buried in the snow. She held it up, her hand trembling. I will not go back. I will not. Elias sighed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated impatience. He stepped toward her. Lydia swung the rock. It was a clumsy, desperate motion. He caught her wrist, his grip like a steel trap. The rock fell from her numb fingers. She tried to fight him, to twist away, but it was like pushing against a mountain. "Stop," he said, his voice quiet but with an edge that cut through her panic. "I am not him. I am not anyone." He held her wrist, and she thrashed against his grip, sobbing in pure terror. "No, no, please." "You are bleeding." She stopped fighting, confused. He was not looking at her face, but at her hand, in her fall, or when she had grabbed the rock. She had sliced her palm open. Blood was welling up, black in the lantern light, dripping onto the snow. His grip on her wrist softened, but did not release. He was still assessing her, his gray eyes unreadable. He looked at her other hand, the one clutching the locket so tightly her knuckles were white. "Give me your hand," he said. "No." "You will get an infection." He spoke as if stating a fact about the weather. He tugged, gently this time. "Your hand." Slowly, trembling, she unfurled. He pulled a canteen from his belt and, without ceremony, poured cold water over the gash. Lydia cried out at the sting. He then produced a relatively clean strip of cloth from his saddlebag and began to wrap her palm. His movements quick and impersonal. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly steady. "Who are you?" she whispered. Finally. "A man going to Helena," he said, tying off the bandage. He glanced at Mrs. Gable, who was still on her knees, rocking back and forth. "There is a burned-out trapper's cabin 1/2 mile north. It will keep the wind off." He offered no more. He did not offer to carry them. He just started walking, picking up the fallen lantern as he went. "What about them?" Mrs. Gable gestured to the dead passengers. "The ground is too hard to bury them. The snow will do it." Elias did not look back. Lydia and Mrs. Gable exchanged a look of pure, shared horror. But the wind was rising, and the cold was seeping back into Lydia's bones. The shadow of the man with the rifle was moving away, his lantern a small, bouncing light in the blizzard. To stay was to die. Lydia pulled her torn coat around her and, helping the older woman to her feet, they staggered after him. The cabin was little more than 4 ruined walls and part of a roof. The wind screamed through the gaps where a door and window had been, but it was shelter. Elias Crow entered and immediately began clearing a space on the dirt floor. He used his knife to shave dry wood from the inside of a charred log and, with a flint and steel, managed to start a small, smoky fire in the broken hearth. The meager flame pushed back the darkness, if not the cold. Eldila and Mrs. Gable huddled near it, shivering. Mrs. Gable had lapsed back into her prayers. Lydia just stared at their rescuer. He sat on the other side of the fire, reloading his rifle. The precise, metallic click-click of the cartridges being seated was the only sound besides the storm and the weeping. He seemed utterly unbothered by the cold, or the company. He was self-contained, a creature of the wilderness, as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. "You are a bounty hunter," Lydia said, the words tumbling out. She had seen the posters in town. She had heard the term. He slid a final cartridge into place. "Sometimes." Were you hunting them?" "No, they were just in the way." He leaned the rifle against the wall and pulled a strip of dried meat from his coat. He bit off a piece, chewing slowly. He did not offer them any. Lydia felt a fresh wave of fear, different this time, not of violence, but of this crushing indifference. He had saved them only because it was convenient, and now he was waiting for them to die or for the morning to come, whichever happened first. She was just another piece of trouble he had stumbled upon. "We thank you, sir," Mrs. Gable murmured, her voice shaky. God has sent you. Elias looked at the fire. God does not come out this far. The silence that followed was heavy. The small fire cast dancing shadows on his scarred face. He looked older than she had first thought, perhaps 30, but with the eyes of an old man. Lydia's wet clothes were beginning to freeze. Her shivers were uncontrollable, rattling her whole frame. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it did no good. Elias watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with another sigh of irritation, he stood up. He walked over to his saddlebag, which he had dropped by the wall, and pulled out a heavy, wool-lined duster, the one he had been wearing. He held it out. Lydia flinched, pulling back so hard she almost fell into the fire. Her reaction was instant. Animal, a man, standing over her, offering something. Her mind screamed. She saw Clive's face, his hand raised. She saw the outlaw's grin. Elias froze. His hand, holding the coat, hung in the air between them. He did not move. He just watched her, his gaze dropping from her terrified face down to her shoulders, where the torn silk of her dress had slipped. In the flickering light of the fire, against the pale white of her skin, the bruises were stark. They were dark, ugly, and shaped like fingers, a cluster of them, old and new, marking the place where she had been grabbed, shaken, and thrown. Lydia saw where he was looking. Shame, hot and sickening, washed over her, more powerful than the cold. She yanked the dress back up, her trembling fingers fumbling with the torn fabric. Elias Crow's face did not change. There was no pity in his eyes, no anger, no surprise. There was, perhaps, a flicker of recognition, so brief she thought she had imagined it. He did not speak. He did not ask what had happened. He did not say a word about the marks. He simply tossed the heavy coat onto the ground near her, careful not to come any closer. Then he turned his back. He walked to the empty doorway, a black silhouette against the raging white storm. He leaned his shoulder against the charred frame, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, and stared out into the night. Mrs. Gable had cried herself to sleep. The fire crackled. The wind howled. Lydia looked at the coat, then at the man's broad, unmoving back. He had seen the truth of her, the marks of her shame, and he had said nothing. He had just given her his coat and turned away. Slowly, her hands shaking, she reached for the duster. It was heavy and smelled of leather, gunpowder, and the cold night air. She wrapped it around herself. It was still warm from his body. The shivering eased. She sat by the fire, clutching the locket in her bandaged hand, and watched the back of the man who had saved her. Neither of them spoke of what they had seen in each other's eyes. There was no need. The silence in the ruined cabin was enough. It was the shared quiet of two people who knew, in their own ways, what it was to be hunted. Dawn broke not as a light, but as a lessening of the dark. The gray, frozen light seeped into the ruined cabin, revealing the true cost of the night. Mrs. Gable was sitting exactly where she had been, her eyes wide and empty, her hands still clasped in her lap. She was rocking, a small, silent motion. Elias Crow stood from his vigil at the door, his joints cracking in the cold. He looked at the woman, then at Lydia, who was huddled in his duster, her face pale and smudged with soot. "The storm has passed," he said. His voice was rough from the cold. He kicked at the remaining embers of the fire. "I am heading to the settlement, Fort Ellis." Lydia got to her feet, her bruised ankles screaming in protest. We are coming with you." Elias looked at Mrs. Gable. The woman did not seem to hear. He walked over and nudged her gently. "Ma'am, it is time to go." She looked up at him, her eyes focusing slowly. "Go? I cannot. My son, he is meeting me in Helena. I cannot." She was broken. The night had shattered something essential inside her. Elias looked at her for a long, hard moment. He was a man who measured survival in minutes and miles. He knew she would not make it. He could not carry her. To try would be to kill all three of them. He made his choice. He walked to his saddlebag, took out the last of the jerked beef he had taken from the bandits, and a small pouch of tinder. He laid them beside her. "Keep the fire high," he said, his voice not unkind, but final. "Someone will find the coach. They will find you." Lydia stared, horrified. "You are leaving her?" "I am saving you," he said, turning his gaze on her. "I cannot save everyone. Are you coming, or are you staying?" The choice was brutal. To stay was to die with a stranger. To go was to trust a man who killed. Lydia looked at the weeping woman, then at the tall, scarred man waiting by the door. She pulled his duster tighter around her. "I am coming." She did not look back as she stepped out of the ruin and into the biting cold. The world was a raw, white emptiness. The snow was knee-deep in places, the wind sculpting it into sharp drifts that cut like glass. They walked into a landscape of frozen rivers, skeletal trees, and a silence so vast it felt like the world's last day. Human life felt like a mistake here, a small, warm thing that the cold was actively trying to erase. Elias moved with a long, economical stride, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He seemed a part of the landscape, as hard and as patient as the stone beneath the snow. Lydia struggled. The silk of her wedding dress, frozen and stiff, chafed her legs. Her borrowed boots, taken from the stagecoach wreckage, were too big and rubbed her feet raw. Her ankle was a throbbing knot of pain. After an hour, she fell, a sharp cry escaping her as her bad leg buckled. She landed hard in a drift, the snow shocking her with its cold. She lay there for a moment, defeated, the tears freezing on her eyelashes. This was it. She would die here, in a white ditch, in a ruined dress. She heard the crunch of his boots in the snow as he walked back to her. She expected him to yell, or to leave her. He stood over her, a dark shape against the blinding sky. He said nothing. He just waited. I cannot," she whispered. The words choked. "My ankle." He shifted his rifle, reached down, and grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet with an almost indifferent strength. She stumbled against him, her face brushing the cold leather of his coat. He smelled of wood smoke and iron. He held her upright until she found her balance. Then he looked around, his eyes scanning the dead trees lining a frozen creek bed. He walked over, broke off a solid, dry branch, and used his knife to blunt the end. He came back and pushed it into her hand, a walking stick. He did not speak. He just turned and started walking again. But this time, his pace was slower, just enough for her to keep up. Eltos, they found a small overhang of rock that offered a meager break from the wind. Elias gathered dry branches from the underside of fallen logs, his movements practiced. Lydia watched him, her hands tucked into her armpits, shivering. He brought out his flint and steel. "You," he said. "What?" "You will make the fire." I do not know how." She had never made a fire in her life. Fires were what servants did, what her father did, what men did. "You will learn." He knelt, arranging a small pile of tinder. He handed her the flint. "You want to live. You learn to make warmth." He put his hand over hers. His palm was rough, scarred, and surprisingly warm. He guided her hand, showing her the sharp, downward strike. Scrape, scrape. A spark flew, then another. The tinder caught, a tiny orange ember. He showed her how to cup her hands, how to blow, a steady, gentle breath. "Not too hard," he cautioned. The ember glowed, and with a sudden whoosh, the tinder exploded into flame. Lydia pulled her hand back, staring at the small fire as if it were a miracle. She had made this, a small knot of pride, something she had not felt in years, loosened in her chest. Elias merely grunted, adding larger sticks. Do not let it die." They sat by the fire, the small blaze pushing back the immense cold. He handed her a piece of hardtack and a strip of dried meat. She saw him break the last piece in two, and she knew, somehow, that he had given her the larger share. They ate in silence. The firelight danced on his scarred face, softening the hard lines. He was watching the sky, not her. "What are you looking at?" she asked, her voice quiet. "The sky? The way the clouds are moving? There is another storm coming. A bad one." She watched him, this man of violence and quiet gestures. He had killed 3 men, but he had given her his coat. He had left a woman to die, but he had slowed his pace for her. He was a puzzle of contradictions. "Do you believe in God, Mr. Crow?" The question was out before she could stop it. It felt important, somehow, to know what a man like this held sacred. He turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes were clear and deep, and held no comfort. "I believe in the sun," he said, his voice low. "I believe in a good horse. I believe in a sharp knife." He looked at the fire. "As for God, I believe only in the parts of him that let us live. The rest is just stories for warm rooms." His answer settled over her, as cold and as final as the landscape. It was the bleakest thing she had ever heard, and the most honest. She noticed him shift, his left hand pressing against his side. He winced, a brief tightening of his jaw. "You are hurt," she said. It was not a question. "From the fight." "It is old," he said, dismissing it. "An old wound can still kill you in the cold." She thought of her father, how he would complain of his old war wound on bitter nights. "Please, let me see. I can help." He looked at her, suspicious. "Why?" "Because you taught me to make a fire." It was a simple, true answer. A trade. He hesitated, his pride warring with the pain. The cold was getting into him. She could see it. Finally, he gave a sharp nod. He unfastened the buttons of his heavy shirt. Lydia drew in a breath. It was an old bullet wound, a puckered, angry scar just above his hip. The edges were red and inflamed, raw from the cold and the strain of the journey. She moved closer, kneeling in the snow. "This is from more than cold." "A souvenir from a sheriff in Texas." She tore a clean strip from the hem of her ruined petticoat. She had no medicines, no salve. "Do you have whiskey?" He handed her his flask. She uncorked it, the smell sharp in the cold air. "This will sting. Just do it." She soaked the cloth and pressed it to the wound. Elias flinched, a sharp, violent intake of breath. His whole body went rigid. But it was not just pain. His eyes were squeezed shut, his face a mask of something else. Lydia's hand stilled. Her fingers were resting just beside the scar, on the warm, tense skin of his side. Her touch, meant to be clinical, suddenly felt different. She was aware of the muscle beneath her hand, the heat of him, the simple, living fact of him. She lingered, just a second too long, her gaze fixed on his face. Does it pain you so much?" she whispered. He opened his eyes. They were dark, haunted. "It is not the wound," he said, his voice thick. He was remembering something. She could feel the memory radiating off him like a cold shadow. A memory of loss, sharp and sudden. He pulled away from her touch, grabbing the flask and taking a long drink. He buttoned his shirt, his movement sharp, angry. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a raw tension. "I am sorry," she said, pulling back. "It is nothing." He stared into the fire, his jaw tight, to fill the new, terrible silence. He began to speak. It was not a confession. It was a shedding of facts, like a snake shedding skin. "I scouted for the army, after the war, hunted men for them." He spat the word hunted. "They paid well. They did not care who I was, so long as I could track." He paused, his voice turning bitter. My father was a white trapper. My mother was Cheyenne. He left her when the beaver trade died. She took me back to her people. They taught me to track. The army taught me to kill what I tracked. He picked up a stick, poking at the fire. Sparks flew up into the gray sky. I saw things. We were sent to find a raiding party. We found the village they came from instead. The soldiers, they did not care. A brave with a rifle, a woman digging roots, a child playing by the creek. It was all the same to them. Innocent blood. He snapped the stick in two, throwing the pieces into the flames. They get paid for it, but you cannot ever wash it off. He looked at her, his eyes flat. In town, they call me Crow, or they call me half-breed. It means the same thing. I am not white enough for them, and after what I did, I am not Cheyenne enough for my mother's people. I am not welcome anywhere. Lydia listened, her own troubles feeling small and distant for a moment. Her fear of him, the man who killed so easily, evaporated. It was replaced by a deep, aching understanding. He was not a monster. He was a man made by monsters. He was as alone as she was, but in a way she could not even fathom. She had been running for 2 days. He had been running his whole life. That night, the nightmares came for her. She was bundled in his duster, sleeping fitfully by the dying fire. Elias sat on the other side, his rifle across his knees, awake. He always seemed to be awake. The dream was the same as always, the smell of whiskey and bay rum. Clive Mercer's face, flushed with drink, his eyes cold and assessing, his thick, powerful hands on her throat, squeezing, not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to terrify. You are mine, Lydia. You are property. She woke with a choked gasp, sitting bolt upright. Her heart was hammering, the scream trapped in her throat. Elias was watching her, his face an unreadable shadow. A bad dream, she whispered, her voice shaking. He will find you, Elias said. It was not a question. It was a statement. Lydia trembled, pulling the coat tighter. Yes. This man you ran from. My husband. The word tasted like ash. Elias just nodded, as if this confirmed everything he had already seen. The bruises on her shoulders, the terror in her eyes. He said nothing more, just turned his gaze back to the darkness beyond the fire. The storm he had predicted arrived the next afternoon. It came on them with the sudden, white fury of an avalanche. The wind screamed, a physical wall of noise and ice. The world vanished into a driving, blinding whiteness. We cannot keep going, Lydia screamed, the words snatched from her mouth. I cannot see. Elias grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. He was squinting into the chaos, his face already caked in ice. This way! He dragged her. They staggered, fell, and got up again. Lydia was no longer walking. She was a dead weight he was pulling through the drifts. The cold was a living thing, clawing at her, seeping into her bones. She was going numb. Just when she was sure she would die, he stopped. He was yelling something, pointing, through the white swirl. She saw it, a dark shape, a smudge, a trapper's hut, half buried in a snowdrift, its roof sagging. He kicked the frozen door open, and they fell inside, out of the wind. The hut was tiny, dark, and smelled of old rot and animal musk, but it was shelter. Lydia collapsed onto the dirt floor, her body shutting down. The journey, the fall, the fear, and now the blinding cold. It was too much. She began to shiver, violent, uncontrollable spasms that shook her whole frame. Elias moved fast. He dropped his pack and began piling dry wood in the small, ruined hearth. He got a fire going, the small hut filling with acrid smoke. He looked at Lydia. She was drenched. Her clothes, her hair, everything was soaked with melted snow. She was already pale, her lips turning blue. You have to get out of those clothes, he said, his voice sharp. Lydia could barely hear him. She was so cold. I cannot move. He knew what this meant. He had seen it before. The fever that came after the cold. The wet clothes would freeze the life right out of her. He hesitated. This was a line, a boundary. But the storm was howling, and the girl was dying. He knelt beside her. "Forgive me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He worked with his usual, impersonal efficiency. He unfastened the buttons of her ruined coat. He had to lift her, his hands brushing her skin. She was hot to the touch, the fever already taking hold. The torn silk of her dress was plastered to her. As he worked, he saw the full map of her suffering. The dark, ugly bruises on her shoulders, the faint, older marks on her ribs. He was gentle, but quick. He got the wet things off her and wrapped her naked, shivering body in his own dry bedroll, pulling her as close to the fire as he dared. He looked at her hand, the one he had bandaged. The cloth was filthy, and the cut on her palm was swollen and red, with angry streaks running up her arm. Poison. He took her hand. It felt small and hot in his. He pulled his flask from his coat, the last of the whiskey. He uncorked it and poured the liquor directly onto the wound. Lydia screamed. The sharp, fiery pain cut through the fever fog. She surfaced from a nightmare. Her vision blurry. She saw a dark shape leaning over her, a man's hands holding her. She whimpered, trying to pull away. "No, no, please." "Be still," Elias said, his voice low, steady. "The cut is poisoned. Be still." His touch was firm, relentless, cleaning the wound. It hurt. It was a clean, sharp agony. Not the dull, bruising pain she was used to. This pain was not meant to harm. It was meant to save. The sting began to fade. She was so tired. His hand was gentle as he used the last clean strip of her petticoat to rebandage her palm. She closed her eyes, sinking back into the warmth of the blankets. The fever was pulling her under, but the pain was gone. She felt his hand, still holding hers. "Please," she breathed, her voice a dry, broken rasp. "Don't stop." She meant the tending, the care, the feeling of not being alone in the pain. Elias froze. His hand, covering hers, felt branded. He heard the words, but he heard them as a man. He heard the whisper of a woman, lost in fever, vulnerable and open. His heart, a muscle he thought had turned to stone, gave a hard, painful lurch. He looked down at her face, pale and angelic in the firelight, her lips slightly parted. He looked at the shape of her, wrapped in his blankets. A deep, powerful, and utterly forbidden desire rose in him. It was a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a longing for softness, for connection, for the simple, human warmth he had denied himself for a decade. He was a man who lived by iron control, and he felt it cracking. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned. He stood abruptly, his breath coming too fast. He walked to the hut's single and cracked window and stared out at the white fury of the blizzard. His fists clenched at his sides. The tension in the tiny, smoke-filled room was suffocating, a silence louder than the storm. Hours passed. The blizzard howled. The fire crackled. Lydia's fever broke with the gray light of the next day. She woke slowly, her mind clear but her body feeling weak and heavy, as if it belonged to someone else. She was warm. She was wrapped tightly in a bedroll. She was undressed. She sat bolt upright, clutching the blankets to her chest. "Oh, God!" Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Elias was across the hut, sharpening his knife by the fire, his back to her. He did not turn. My clothes," she stammered. "They were wet. You had a fever." His voice was flat, impersonal. He nodded with his head toward the fire. Her dress and coat were hanging from a wooden peg, steaming dry. Relief flooded her, so potent it made her dizzy. He had saved her. Then, a new, hot wave of embarrassment. He had seen her, all of her, The bruises, the scars.
You
were dying, he said, not looking up from the whetstone. The shing, shing, shing of the stone was a steady, calming sound. It was that, or bury you. The cold, practical truth of it anchored her. He had not done it for pleasure, or for cruelty. He had done it for survival. His survival. Her survival. It was the law of the prairie. Then she remembered a dream. His hands on hers, the sting of the whiskey, her own voice.
I said something, did I not?
She asked, her voice small.
When I was sick.
Elias stopped sharpening. The silence in the hut was absolute, broken only by the wind. He looked at the long, glittering edge of the blade. You were delirious, he said. What did I say? Elias? He did not answer for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned his head and met her gaze. His eyes were dark, guarded, but she saw something new in their depths, a raw vulnerability he could not quite hide. You said, please, don't stop. Lydia's face burned. The blood rushed to her cheeks, a heat that had nothing to do with fever. She understood, instantly, how a man would hear those words, whispered by a woman he had just undressed.
Oh no,
she whispered, horrified.
Elias, I did not mean, I meant the bandage. You were cleaning my hand. It hurt, but it was helping. I meant that.
She was flustered, humiliated, her hands twisting the blanket. He was a man, she was a woman. They were trapped here, and she had said that. Elias looked away from her, back to the fire. He felt a strange, conflicting mix of pure relief and something like disappointment. And he felt shame for that disappointment. I know, he lied, his voice rougher than he intended. But the lie hung in the air between them, thin and transparent. They both knew he had misunderstood. And the misunderstanding, now cleared, had left something else in its place. A shared, dangerous knowledge, an awareness that had not been there before. Lydia pulled the blankets tighter, her heart pounding for a reason that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the man across the room. Elias went back to his knife, the rhythmic shing, shing, shing of the stone returning, a desperate attempt to restore the simple, empty silence. Outside, the blizzard howled, a wild, lonely sound that echoed the turmoil that had just been unleashed in the tiny hut. The storm broke on the third day, as if a hand had simply turned off the wind. The silence it left behind was vast and absolute, a ringing in the ears. The world was a fresh, unmarked white, the sky a pale, aching blue. Inside the trapper's hut, the air was stale with smoke and unspoken words. The embarrassment of the night before hung between them, thick and uncomfortable. Lydia, dressed again in her dry, ruined clothes, sat small by the hearth. Elias was already outside. She heard the sound of his hatchet, a sharp thunk, thunk, thunk in the new quiet. When she emerged, he had already felled 2 small saplings and was lashing them together with rope from his pack. He was building a travois, a simple sled. What is that for? She asked, her voice hoarse. Supplies, he said, not looking up. His hands were quick and sure, his knots tight. And for you, the walking will be slow in this. Lydia looked at the deep snow. He was right, but the thought of him pulling her, of being a dead weight, a burden he was forced to drag, was more than she could bear, after he had cared for her. No, she said. He paused, the rope held tight in his teeth. He looked at her. I will not be pulled, she said, her voice shaking but firm. She held up the walking stick he had made for her. I will walk. His gray eyes measured her. He saw the new set of her jaw, the line of resolve that had not been there 2 days before. He saw the defiance, and he saw the strength beneath it. He gave a single sharp nod. The supplies! Then, He finished the sled, loaded their meager gear, his bedroll, the empty flask, his cookpot, and slung the harness over his own chest. He looked like a draft horse, a man built to pull heavy loads. "We follow the creek bed south," he said. "It will lead to the river. The river leads to the fort." And so they walked, two small, dark figures in an ocean of white. He pulled the sled, breaking the trail. She followed in his footsteps, her stick sinking deep, her ankle a dull, grinding ache. But she did not complain. She just watched his back, the steady, rhythmic pull of his shoulders, and she kept moving. By afternoon, the landscape began to change. The endless prairie gave way to low, broken hills, and in a shallow valley, huddled against a bluff, they saw the town. It was not a town, it was the corpse of one. There were a dozen buildings, gray and leaning, their windows like empty eye sockets. A sign, hanging by one hinge, read Providence. A bitter joke. The street was a canyon of wind and silence. "A ghost town," Lydia whispered, stopping. It felt wrong to enter, like walking through a graveyard. "Shelter," Elias said, and he did not stop. He pulled the sled down the main street. The wind was the only resident. It whistled through the gaps in the saloon's bat-wing doors, making them rattle and slap. It moaned in the chimney of the ruined assay office. A metal bucket rolled slowly across a collapsed boardwalk. The desolation was profound. It was a monument to failure, to hopes that had frozen and died right here. Lydia felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. This was a place where people had come to build a life, and it had beaten them. It had swallowed them. The emptiness mirrored her own. She felt as hollow as the buildings, as scoured out and abandoned. Elias stopped in front of what had been a small general store. One of the walls had collapsed, but three were still standing, and a good portion of the roof held. "Here, we will rest." He built a fire in the middle of the floor, the smoke rising up through the hole in the roof. They sat on an overturned crate, the silence of the dead town pressing in on them. Lydia looked at Elias. He was staring into the flames, his face hard, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. He was as abandoned as this place, an outcast, a man with no town, no people. She had felt shame about her bruises, her weakness. But here, in this place of endings, her secret felt different. It felt like part of the landscape. "His name is Clive Mercer," she said, the words quiet, but they filled the ruined store. Elias turned his head, his gaze slow, questioning. My husband," she clarified. The word was still poison. "You asked who I was running from." She had to say it. She had to make him understand that she was not just a whim, not just a flighty woman. She was a survivor. "My father lost his ranch, gambling. He drank, Mr. Mercer. He is a rich man. He owns half the territory. He says he paid my father's debts. And in return," she did not need to finish. Elias just watched her, his face a mask. His stillness was terrifying. It made her want to fill the silence, to justify herself. He was not kind," she stammered. "The first night at his ranch, he grabbed me. He said I was his, like his cattle. She touched her ribs, an involuntary motion. "He broke 2 of my ribs, because I would not be—" She could not say the word. "He said if I ever tried to run, he would find me. He would break my legs so I would have to crawl. He said he would mark my face, so no other man would ever look at me." The confession spilled out, a torrent of poison she had held for months. The fear, the humiliation, the cold, hard fact of his cruelty. When she was finished, she was trembling, expecting him to look away, to show disgust. Elias did not move for a long time. His eyes were fixed on her face, but he seemed to be looking through her, at the man she was describing. His jaw was so tight a muscle jumped, his hand resting on his knee. had clenched into a white-knuckled fist. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, guttural rasp. "You were right to run," he said. That was all. Just 5 words. But they were the first words of validation she had ever heard. Not pity, not judgment, just a simple, hard statement of fact. It felt like a stone being lifted from her chest. She had been right. It did not matter what the law said, what her father said. She had been right. She let out a breath she did not know she was holding, and for the first time since she had climbed out that window, she did not feel ashamed. She felt clean. They left the town of ghosts behind and pushed on. The confession had changed the air between them. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a new, somber understanding. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were 2 people defined by the violence of others. They made camp that evening in a thicket of cottonwoods by the frozen edge of a wide, shallow river. The ice was a sheet of milky gray, the water running dark and fast beneath it in a narrow channel. While Lydia gathered wood, her movements stronger now, Elias sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He had laid the pieces of the big sharps on a piece of oilcloth. His hands, which she knew to be rough and scarred, moved with a surprising, gentle precision. He was not a brute. He was not clumsy. He was careful. He treated the weapon with a kind of intimate respect. It was a tool. She understood. Just like his knife. Just like his flint. It was the part of him that let him live. There was a grace in his roughness. It was in the way he built the fire, the way he had bandaged her hand, the way he had carved the sled. It was the grace of pure, economical purpose. She also noticed the way he never looked at her, not directly. Since the incident in the hut, he kept his gaze averted. He would look at her hands, her feet, the space just over her shoulder, but he would not meet her eyes. She had thought at first it was his shame, or hers, but now she saw it was something else. It was a willed restraint. It was the deliberate act of a man banking a fire, keeping the embers from catching. He was afraid to look at her, and that simple, unspoken fact made her heart beat in a strange, unfamiliar way. He was refilling his cartridge belt, his head bent, when a folded piece of paper slipped from his coat pocket and drifted onto the snow. "You dropped something," she said, moving to pick it up. He lunged for it, his hand snatching it from the snow. But he was not fast enough. The paper had fallen open. Lydia saw the crude woodcut drawing. A man's face, scarred. She saw the words, printed in thick, black letters. "Wanted."
"Elias,"
she whispered, her hand freezing in midair. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his face closing down, becoming the cold, hard mask she had seen at the stagecoach wreck. "It is nothing," he said, his voice flat. He stuffed the paper back into his pocket.
"Nothing?"
Lydia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river.
"Who are you? Elias, you said you were a scout. That is a bounty notice. For you. I saw it."
He stood, turning his back to her, and walked to the river's edge. He stared into the black, running water.
"Please,"
she said, coming up behind him.
"You know my truth. Do not lie to me."
He was silent for a long time, the only sound the hiss of the fire and the distant cry of a hawk. "In Texas," he began, his voice low, "I was tracking a man for the marshals. I stopped in a town called Redemption, a bad place, full of men who hated anything that was not white." He picked up a piece of river ice, turning it over in his hand. "There was a sheriff, a man named Harlan. He was stringing up a boy, a Cheyenne boy, maybe 14 years old. Said the boy stole a loaf of bread from the mercantile." Lydia put her hand to her mouth. The shopkeep was right there, yelling that the boy had paid, that it was a mistake. But Harlan, he did not care. He had his rope, he had his tree, and he had his reasons. Elias's voice was devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of facts. The boy he was my mother's people. He was scared. He did not even understand all their words. He crushed the ice in his fist, the pieces falling onto the snow. I told him to cut the boy down. Harlan laughed. He called me what they all call me. He told me to watch a redskin swing. He turned, his gray eyes finally meeting hers. They were filled with a cold, ancient fire. So I killed him, Elias said. I shot him, right there in the street. I cut the boy down and told him to run. And I have been running ever since. Lydia stared at him, the whole world tilting on its axis. This was the man she had feared. This was the killer, the bounty hunter. So you are not a criminal, she whispered, the realization dawning, bright and sharp. You are not a murderer. The law says I am. The law, she said, her voice filled with a sudden, new venom, is a man named Harlan. The law is a man named Clive Mercer. His story unlocked the last piece of him. He was not a man who hunted for money. He was a man who had been punished, cast out, for one single act of compassion, one act of justice. His reputation, his loneliness, his hard, cold shell. It was all a defense. It was the armor he had been forced to build because the world had tried to hang him for having a heart. The distance between them was gone, annihilated. She did not just see him anymore. She knew him. That night, the cold was deeper. The fire seemed smaller, but the space between them was charged, alive. He took the flask from his pocket. It was not empty. He had saved the last of it. He held it out to her. For the cold. She took it, her fingers brushing his. She took a small sip, the whiskey burning a trail down her throat, warming her from the inside. She handed it back. He drank, his throat working. Ohio, she said, her voice soft. He looked at her, questioning. I am from Ohio, she explained. Before my father lost everything. We had a house, with a garden. I like to read books. My mother taught me. He listened, his head tilted. I have never seen Ohio. It is green, she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. Not like this. It is soft. Everything here is so hard. I was born near the bighorns, he said, his voice quiet. I remember my mother teaching me to track a snow hare, how to be quiet, how to see what is not there. I remember the sky. It was so big you felt like you could fall right into it. They talked. They traded small, broken pieces of their pasts, the things they had loved, the things they had lost. They were not memories he could share in a saloon, or she in a parlor. They were the memories of ghosts. And then, Lydia did something she had not done in a year. She laughed. He had been telling her about a greenhorn from back east he had been forced to guide. A man who thought a buffalo was just a hairy cow. The story was simple, dryly told, but the image was so absurd. A rusty, choked sound bubbled up out of her. It was a real laugh. The sound startled them both. It echoed in the cold air, a bright, living thing. And Elias Crow smiled. It was not a full smile. It was just a lifting at the corners of his mouth, a crinkling at the edges of his scarred eye. But it transformed his face. It wiped away the decades of pain, the cold, the hardness. For 1 second, he was just a man. Lydia's laughter died, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at him, mesmerized. He was beautiful. The silence that fell was more intimate than any touch. The firelight played on her face, turning her hair to copper. A strand of it had fallen loose, clinging to her cheek. He looked at it. He looked at her mouth, still parted from her laugh. He was not seeing a runaway. He was seeing a woman, slowly, as if pulled by a string. He lifted his hand. It was an unconscious movement, a thing of pure instinct. His rough fingers, calloused from rope and iron, brushed the hair from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, hesitant. It was a jolt. For her, a shock of warmth and tenderness so foreign it terrified her. For him, the simple contact with her soft skin was a cataclysm. It was the softness of Ohio, the warmth of a life he could never have. It was hope, and hope was a danger he could not afford. He snatched his hand back, as if he had touched the fire. He stood abruptly, his whole body tense. "I will take the first watch," he said, his voice a harsh growl. He grabbed his rifle and stalked to the edge of the camp, turning his back to her, a rigid dark sentinel against the snow. Lydia sat by the fire, her cheek tingling where he had touched her. She was trembling, but not from the cold. The next morning, the new, fragile world they had built shattered. Elias woke before dawn, his guard firmly back in place. The man who had almost smiled was gone, replaced by the tracker. He made a silent circuit of the camp, his eyes scanning the fresh snow. Lydia was packing the sled when he returned. She knew instantly that something was wrong. His face was stone. "What is it?" "Get your things," he said, his voice flat, dead.
"Elias, what is it?"
He grabbed her arm, his grip tight, impersonal. "Horse tracks, 6 riders. They crossed the river 2 miles downstream. They are following the bank, following us." The blood drained from Lydia's face. "Mercer?" "They are riding hard. They will be here by noon." He was already cutting the harness from the sled. He threw the supplies into his pack. "You take the rest of the food. You will follow the river. Do not stop. Do not build a fire."
What about you?"
she whispered, her hands numb. "I will lead them south, into the breaks. They are hunting me, too. They will follow the bigger target." He was going to sacrifice himself. He was going to use his own bounty notice as a shield to protect her. "No," she said. "This is not a choice," he snarled, throwing the pack at her feet. "It is survival. Now go." "No." She looked him dead in the eye, the terror still there. But beneath it, something new, something hard, the same resolve he had seen when she refused to be pulled on the sled. "I will not run," she said. "Not while you—" "You will slow me down," he yelled, his voice cracking with a sudden, raw panic. He was not afraid of the riders. He was afraid for her. "Then I will slow you down," Lydia said, picking up her walking stick. "You are not leaving me. I am not leaving you. We are done running alone." Their loyalty, born of shared survival, had just turned into something else. It was no longer about living. It was about who they would choose to die with. Elias stared at her, his face a war of fury and a strange, agonizing tenderness. He saw her resolve, and he knew it was as unbending as his own. She would not go. He turned and looked south, down the river, where the riders would come. Then he nodded, a single, grim motion. To the foothills, then together. They did not run south. They ran west, toward the hard, jagged spine of the mountains. They climbed out of the river valley, out of the open snowfields, and into the foothills. Here, the world changed. The snow thinned, clinging only to the north-facing slopes and the deep shadows. The landscape was no longer a white, open page, but a maze of gray rock, steep ravines, and the dark, solemn green of pine forests. The air was different, sharper, smelling of resin and cold stone. Mist clung to the trees, swallowing the world, hiding them in a way the open prairie never could. But the new terrain was harder. Lydia's ankle, which had begun to heal, was raw and swollen again. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from climbing rock. Elias pushed them hard, his senses stretched taut, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines behind them. They found shelter the second night in a cave, a shallow scoop in the granite that reeked of bobcat. Elias built a small, smokeless fire just inside the mouth. He was checking his weapons. He had the sharps, his own revolver, and a second one, a smaller, pearl-handled pistol he had taken from the dead outlaw. He had been carrying it, unused, in his pack. He finished cleaning it, oiled the mechanism, and loaded the chambers. He held it out to her, butt first. Lydia looked at it, her eyes wide.
What? What for?
For them, he said, his voice flat. For Mercer, for the men who follow. You cannot just run. You cannot just hide. You have to be able to fight. She flinched, pulling her hands back.
I cannot.
You made a fire, he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. You walked on a bad leg. You will do this. Take it. Her hand trembled so badly she could barely close her fingers around the grip. It was heavy. So heavy, it felt wrong. A cold, dense piece of death in her palm. It is just a tool, he said, his voice low, calm. He moved behind her, his presence a wall of warmth at her back. He did not touch her, not yet. Hold it up. Point it at that dead tree. She lifted it, her arm shaking. He knelt beside her. Your hand is shaking. He placed his own hand over hers, correcting her grip. His fingers were rough, but his touch was incredibly gentle, arranging her fingers, one over the other, his thumbs settling her own. You are holding it too tight. You let it breathe. You point. You do not aim. You just point, and you squeeze. Smoothly. Do not jerk it. His voice was a low murmur, close to her ear. It was the calmest she had ever heard him. It was the voice he used for frightened horses. She realized. Now, he whispered. She squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The gun kicked in her hand, the force of it shocking her arm to the shoulder. The smell of sulfur and burnt powder filled the air. She had missed the tree by 6 feet. She dropped the gun, her hands flying to her ears, a small cry escaping her. She was trembling from head to toe. Elias did not raise his voice. He simply picked up the pistol and placed it back in her hand. Again, with your eyes open. This time, you will not be surprised. He made her shoot until the 6 chambers were empty. She hit the tree twice. Again, he said, and he showed her how to reload. She practiced until her shoulder ached and her hand was numb, but she was no longer trembling. The weight of the gun felt manageable. It felt like a choice. He was not just teaching her to kill. He was teaching her his language, the language of survival. They traveled for 2 more days, climbing higher, the men following them. If they were still following, were far behind, lost in the confusing terrain. The immediacy of the danger faded, replaced by the simple, grinding needs of hunger and warmth. On the 3rd day, they came over a ridge and looked down into a small, snowy valley. In the center of it was a cluster of buildings, an outpost. Smoke rose from a single chimney. We need food, Elias said, his voice tight. And coffee, and ammunition. But they are looking for us. We are Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, he said, from Oregon. Passing through, you will stay quiet. You will let me talk. We trade the pelts I took from the trapper's hut. We buy what we need. We leave. The outpost was a single building, part store, part saloon, part stable. The inside was hot, dim, and smelled of stale beer, cured hides, and frying bacon. For Lydia, the warmth was a physical shock. It had been so long. A few men, trappers, a freighter, sat at a table, their voices low. A burly man with a huge beard stood behind the counter. Elias, his hat pulled low, his scar hidden in the shadow, began to bargain, his voice a low, impersonal rumble. He bartered the skins for flour, coffee, dried beans, and a box of cartridges for the pistol. Lydia stood by the door, trying to make herself small. A woman in a calico dress, the proprietor's wife, was sweeping the floor. She smiled at Lydia, a real human smile. Lydia felt a sudden, desperate urge to weep. It was the simple, ordinary kindness of it. She found herself smiling back. For a few minutes, standing in that warm, dim room, she was not a runaway. She was not a fugitive. She was just a woman, waiting for her husband. She felt almost human again. She let her eyes drift around the room, taking in the shelves of tinned goods, the bolts of cloth, the barrels of nails. And then she saw it. It was nailed to the wall by the door, right next to a notice for land auctions. It was a piece of paper, newer than the others. Her heart stopped. The drawing was crude, but unmistakable. It was Elias. The scar was drawn in thick, dark ink, but the words were what struck her cold. Wanted, $500. For the capture, dead or alive, of Elias Crow, known as the half-breed, for murder, and for his accomplice, a woman known as Lydia, a thief who fled her lawful husband, Clive Mercer, with stolen property. A woman thief and the half-breed murderer. The room tilted, the heat, the smell of bacon, it all rushed in on her, making her sick. Thief, murderer. He had done it. Mercer had tied them together. He had poisoned the whole world against them. There was no escape. There was no Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. There was only the murderer and the thief. She grabbed Elias' arm. Her fingers dug into his muscle. "Elias, we have to go, now!" He saw her face. The blood drained from it, the sheer terror in her eyes. He saw her looking at the wall. He did not need to read the poster. He knew. He dropped a few more coins on the counter, grabbed their supplies, and pushed her toward the door. "What's your hurry, friend?" A voice stopped them. A man at the table, a greasy trapper with a stained beard, was looking at them. He pushed his chair back. Standing up, he was looking from the poster to Elias, a slow, ugly grin spreading across his face. "I know you," the man said, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "You're that half-breed killer. And that's Mercer's woman." The room went silent. The proprietor ducked behind the counter. Elias did not turn around. He did not speak. He just shoved Lydia, hard, out the door. "Run to the trees," he commanded. Lydia stumbled out into the snow, her heart hammering. She heard a shout from inside. She turned, terrified. The trapper was in the doorway, his gun half drawn. "Stop, or I'll—" Elias was a shadow inside the dim room. He had not drawn his own gun. He had his rifle. The boom of the sharps inside the small building was an explosion. It was deafening. The trapper in the doorway was thrown backward, as if hit by a giant, invisible fist. He landed on his back in the snow, a huge, dark hole in his chest. He did not move. Lydia stared, horrified. Her hands flew to her mouth, but she could not scream. Elias stepped out of the doorway, the rifle smoking in his hand. He grabbed the bag of supplies and her arm in one motion. "Now," he said, his voice a guttural growl. "Run." They ran until their lungs were on fire, until Lydia's legs gave out, and she collapsed in the deep shadow of the pine forest, miles from the outpost. That night, they found another abandoned cabin, a line shack left by a rancher. It was small, cold, and the door was gone, but it was shelter. Elias built a fire, his movements jerky, angry. He had not said a word since the killing. He was closed off, his face a mask of stone. He sat cleaning the sharps, his back to her, scrubbing the barrel with a furious, mechanical precision. Lydia watched him, her body shaking. The image of the man falling backward into the snow, his eyes wide with surprise, was burned into her mind. Dead. Elias had killed him. For her, to protect her. The man had died because he had recognized her. She had been right. She was a curse. "It is my fault," she whispered, her voice raw. Elias's hand stilled on the rifle. He did not turn. "It is all my fault," she said, the words beginning to tumble out, a dam of grief and guilt breaking. My father, his ranch, gone, because of me. He sold me. The men on the stagecoach, they died. Mrs. Gable. We left her. She stood up, her fists clenched, her voice rising.
And that man today, he died because of me, because he saw me.
She staggered toward him, her whole body shaking. Do you not see? She cried, her voice breaking. I am poison. I am a curse. Everyone, every man who touches me, everyone who tries to help me, they end up ruined or dead. She reached him, and she began to beat her fists against his broad, unyielding back. You should have left me. You should have let me die in the snow. I am not worth this. She was sobbing. Great, tearing sobs that ripped from her throat. She was breaking apart. All the terror, all the pain, all the shame. It all came pouring out. Elias did not flinch. He just sat there, taking the blows. Then, slowly, he set the rifle aside. He turned and, in one movement, he pulled her against him. He held her. She was still fighting him, still sobbing, her fists pounding weakly against his chest. I am cursed! I am cursed! No, he said, his voice a low, rough rumble against her ear. He just held her, his arms wrapped around her, his hand pressing her head against his chest. He held her like a man holding onto a post in a flood. You are not. You are just alive. And it is a hard thing to be. She collapsed against him, her fight gone, replaced by a deep, shuddering grief. She cried into his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. She was not a curse. She was just alive. The words were a kind of absolution. He held her for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and her ragged, broken sobs. He stroked her hair, his rough hand clumsy, hesitant, but so unspeakably gentle. She quieted. She was still trembling, but the storm had passed. She was pressed against him, her face in the hollow of his neck. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart. She could smell the smoke, the leather, the man himself. She tilted her head back, looking up at him. His face was inches from hers, the firelight carved shadows under his scarred cheekbone. His eyes were no longer cold. They were dark, and they were filled with a pain that mirrored her own. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at Harlan, the sheriff. He was looking at the village he had seen burned. He was looking at the trapper he had just killed. He saw her.
Elias,
she breathed. It was not a conscious thought. It was a need as deep and as raw as the hunger for food or the need for warmth. It was the need to not be alone, not for one more second. She reached up, her trembling fingers touching his scar. He flinched, but he did not pull away. And then he kissed her. Or she kissed him. Neither of them knew. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was a clash of pain and longing. A raw, clumsy collision of two people at the end of their rope. It was the taste of whiskey, and smoke, and salt from her tears. It was not tender. It was a drowning man's grasp for air. He deepened the kiss, his hand moving from her hair to the back of her neck, pulling her closer, as if he could absorb her, hide her inside himself. His other arm was a steel band around her waist, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. She clung to him, her hands fisting in his shirt. This was not the bruising, taking grip of Clive Mercer. This was a different kind of violence. It was a violence of shared desperation. He pulled back, his breath ragged, his forehead resting against hers. They were both shaking.
Lydia,
he whispered, his voice thick, a warning. To her, to himself.
Do not,
she whispered back, her eyes closed.
Please, do not speak. Do not stop.
He heard the words, the same words from the snowstorm. But this time, they both knew what they meant. He lifted her then, as if she weighed nothing, and carried her to his bedroll, the one they had shared for warmth. but never like this. He laid her down, the firelight painting her skin in shades of gold and red. They came together in a kind of frantic silence. Their movements were not born of love. Not yet, but of a fierce, terrible need. It was an attempt to erase. His hands, rough and calloused, moved over her. He felt the old, faded ridges of her broken ribs. He felt the scar on her palm where she had cut it. He was touching her history, her pain. Her hands found the puckered bullet wound on his side. She found the tight, knotted muscles of his back, the map of his own hard life. She was learning him, not with words, but with her fingers. They were two survivors, two scarred and broken people, and in the dark, cold cabin, they were trembling, not from fear, but from the terrifying, agonizing relief of being truly seen. They were trying to press their broken pieces together, to drive the pain out, to erase the scars, the brands of Mercer and Harlan, and a world that wanted them dead. It was a desperate, silent battle, and the only comfort was the warmth of each other's skin, a confirmation that they were, against all odds, still alive. In the pale, gray light of morning, Elias woke first. He always woke first. He looked at Lydia, asleep beside him, her face peaceful for the first time. Her hair was spread across his blanket, her arm thrown over his chest. She looked young, innocent, and he felt a cold, sharp terror unlike anything he had ever known. He had let her in. He had let himself hope. He had felt, for one night, a connection that went beyond survival. He had felt peace, and hope, he knew, was a danger. Hope was a distraction. Hope was the thing you held just before the world snatched it away. Hope was what got you killed. He had a new, terrible weakness. He had something to lose. He regretted, not the act, but the hope it had planted in him. It was a seed of a life he could never have. Lydia stirred, her eyes opening. She saw him watching her, his face grim, his guard already back up. She did not feel shame. She did not feel regret. She felt strong. She looked at her body, at his, at the small, safe space they had carved out of the night. She had faced her curse. She had confessed her deepest fear. And he had not run. He had held her. He had touched her, not with cruelty, but with a matching desperation. She felt a new kind of love. It was not the soft, green love of Ohio. It was a love born of pain. Not despite it. It was hard and sharp and resilient. It was a love that could survive in this land. She reached up, her fingers tracing the scar on his jaw. "Good morning, Elias." He could not answer. He could not meet her eyes. He stood, pulling on his boots, his movements stiff. The peace was gone. The morning had brought the world crashing back. He walked to the doorless opening of the cabin and froze.
"What is it?"
Lydia asked, sitting up, pulling the blanket around her. Elias did not turn. He was listening, his head tilted.
"Get dressed, now!"
He grabbed his rifle, and then she heard it too, far down in the valley, the jingle of a harness, the cough of a man. He looked back at her, his face etched with a terrible finality. A posse, not Mercer's men, bounty men, following my trail. They were trapped. The valley was a dead end. Lydia got to her feet, her new strength a cold, hard knot in her stomach. "Run," Elias said, checking the load in his rifle. "Take the back way. Climb. Hide." "No," she said. "This is not a debate. Lydia, they want me. I will lead them away. You will live." "And what?" she said, her voice shaking but full of iron. "I will wait for you. I will spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for him, waiting for them. No." She walked to him. She was dressed. She picked up the small, pearl-handled pistol. She checked the load, just as he had taught her. "You are done running, Elias," she said. "So am I." He looked at her, at the gun in her hand, at the absolute resolve in her eyes. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. She was his. He knew he could not send her away, and he knew he could not run. There was only one way this ended.
Mercer,
Elias said, his voice a low growl. This posse, they are just dogs. Mercer is the one holding the leash. As long as he is alive, he will never stop hunting you. We will never be free. He made his decision. It was the only one left. I am going to his ranch, he said. I am going to end this.
I know,
Lydia said, her hand steady on the pistol.
we are.
They left the foothills behind, trading the cover of the pines for the crushing emptiness of the high plains. This was Mercer's kingdom. The land was flat, vast, and offered nowhere to hide. The sky was a low, bruised gray, a heavy lid on a cold, empty world. They traveled only in the hours of dusk and pre-dawn, hiding in dry creek beds during the day, chewing on the last of their dried meat. The night they had shared in the line shack was gone. It had not been forgotten, but it had been packed away. A small, warm ember buried deep under the cold ash of necessity. They were no longer a man and a woman. They were two weapons, aimed at the same target. They moved with a grim, silent purpose. Elias had given her the second revolver, and she wore it on her hip, the weight of it a constant, cold reminder. On the third day of their march, they saw it. It was not a light or a building. It was the smoke. Dozens of miles away, on the flat horizon, a dark smudge stained the sky. It was not the clean, thin smoke of a single cabin. It was the thick, greasy smoke of a dozen fires, of 100 men, of rendered fat and forge fires and industry. It was the smoke of power.
The ranch,
Elias said, his voice a low rasp. It took them another full day to reach the edge of the property. They hid on a low rise, looking down into the valley he had carved out for himself. It was not a ranch. It was a fortress. A massive, 2-story main house, built of thick pine logs, stood in the center. It was surrounded by a dozen other buildings, bunkhouses, barns, a blacksmith's shop, a cookhouse. A high, sharpened palisade wall enclosed the main compound. Men with rifles walked the perimeter. The smoke rose from the chimneys of the house, the bunkhouse, the cookhouse, staining the gray sky. A constant, arrogant declaration of ownership. Lydia felt her insides turn to water. This was not a man. It was an army.
How?
She whispered, the pistol on her hip feeling like a child's toy. Elias, we cannot. There must be 50 men. Elias did not answer. He just lay on his stomach in the frozen grass, his eyes unblinking, watching. He watched for the entire day. He watched the guards change. He watched the flow of men from the bunkhouse to the cookhouse. He watched the light in the main house, noting which windows lit and which went dark. He was a hunter, learning the habits of his prey. He is in the main house, Elias said, as darkness finally fell. On the second floor, the corner room. He keeps a light on late. What good does that do? We cannot get past the wall. We cannot get past the guards. We do not go past them, Elias said. We make them come out. He pointed to the far side of the compound. There, the main hay barn. It sits outside the wall. It is full, dry. It will burn fast. Lydia looked at the huge structure.
You,
Elias said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion.
You will set the fire. You will use the kerosene from the lamp in the stable.
When the bell rings, when every man runs to the barn, I will go over the wall. On the far side, I will go to the house. I will find him. Lydia's blood ran cold.
A distraction.
A distraction, he confirmed. They will all run to save the hay. It is their winter feed. It is their life. They will all run, except perhaps him. He will stay in his house. That is where I will be. She looked at him, at his scarred, focused face. He was asking her to walk into the lion's den. He was trusting her.
I can do it, she said, her voice shaking, but her hands steady.
They waited until the deepest part of the night, the hour before dawn when the cold was at its worst and men's senses were at their dullest. The moon was a sliver, hidden by clouds. "I will find you," Elias whispered, his hand touching her arm. It was not a promise of affection. It was a statement of fact. "When it is done, I will find you by the horses. Do not wait. If I am not there in 5 minutes, you ride. Do you understand? Lydia, you ride." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He moved. He did not make a sound. He was a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He vanished into the darkness, moving toward the high palisade wall. Lydia was alone. She waited. She counted to 500, her heart a cold, hard hammer in her chest. Then she began to move. She ran, crouched low, toward the stables, which were dark and quiet. The stable boy was asleep in the tack room. She could hear him snoring. Her pistol was in her hand, the cold metal biting into her palm. She found the lamp, just as Elias had said. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She poured half the kerosene onto a bundle of rags, soaking them. Then she ran to the hay barn. The huge double doors were barred. She slipped around the side to a small ventilation hatch near the ground. She pulled it open. The smell of sweet, dry hay washed over her. This was it. She looked back at the dark compound, all quiet. She struck a match. The small flame flared, bright and terrifying. She held it to the oil-soaked rags. They erupted in a whoosh of blue and orange flame. She shoved the burning bundle deep into the hay. For a second, nothing happened. Then she heard a sound, a deep foom, as the fire caught the dry air. A bright orange light flickered from within the barn. She ran. She was 20 yards away when the yelling started.
Fire! Fire in the barn!
A bell began to ring, a frantic, clanging alarm that shattered the night. Doors burst open. Men, half-dressed, poured out of the bunkhouse, shouting, disorganized.
The hay! Get the bucket line! It is too late! Get the horses out of the stable!
The distraction was working. Every man in the compound was running, a tide of chaos, toward the now raging inferno. The barn was a tower of flame, lighting the entire valley, turning the night to a hellish, flickering day. Lydia did not run toward the horses. She hid in the shadows of the blacksmith shop, her heart in her throat, watching the main house, waiting. She saw a light flicker on the second floor, but the front door of the house remained closed. Elias was inside. He was hunting.
"He will burn us out!" a man yelled.
"El Tosa's what I thought you would do," a voice sneered. Lydia froze. The voice, it was ice in her veins. Clive Mercer stepped out of the shadow of the cookhouse, not 10 feet from her. He was not running toward the fire. He was calm. He was fully dressed, a heavy coat on, a pistol in his hand. He had been waiting. "I knew you would come back," he said, his eyes cold and pale, glittered in the firelight. "A bad coin. You always turn up." Lydia raised her pistol. Her hand was shaking so badly she could not hold it steady. Mercer laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. "You think that can hurt me? You are mine, Lydia. You are property, and property does not get to fight back." He lunged. He did not go for the gun. He was too fast, too strong. He slapped the pistol from her hand, the blow sending a shock of pain up her arm. He grabbed her, not by the arm, but by her hair, just as he had done before. He yanked her head back, pulling her off her feet. She screamed, a sharp, thin sound of agony and terror.
"You think you can run?"
he snarled, his face close to hers, his breath hot and smelling of whiskey. "You think you can bring your half-breed murderer to my home?" He began to drag her, by her hair, across the frozen, rutted ground, toward the main house. "You think you can wash my name off you?" he spat, his voice a low, vicious growl. "I am going to burn it into you, I am going to show you what happens to a thief who forgets who she belongs to." Lydia clawed at his hand, but his grip was iron. The pain was blinding. She was back where she started. She had failed. She was his.
"Let her go. Mercer." The voice cut through the chaos.
"Elias."
He was standing on the porch of the main house, his rifle in his hand. He had come out, drawn by her scream. The plan was broken. Mercer laughed. A full-throated roar. He pulled Lydia in front of him, his arm snaking around her throat, using her as a shield. "Crow! I knew you would be sniffing around her. You came for the bounty, or just for the whore?" "Let her go," Elias said. His voice was dead calm. He had not raised the rifle.
"You are in my house, dog,"
Mercer sneered.
"My men are all around us. You are a dead man. You both are."
"The men are at the fire," Elias said.
"It is just you, and me, and her."
Mercer shoved the barrel of his pistol hard against Lydia's temple.
"Drop the rifle, or I will paint the snow with her brains. Right here, right in front of you."
Lydia could not breathe. She was choking, her feet dangling, Mercer's arm a band of iron across her throat. Elias looked at her. His eyes were dark, filled with an agony she could not name. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the Sharp's rifle and let it fall to the wooden porch with a clatter. "Good boy." Mercer grinned. "Now the pistol." Slowly. Elias unbuckled his holster and let the pistol drop. He stood, his hands empty. "See, Lydia?" Mercer's voice was a triumphant purr in her ear. "They all bend. They all break. Now, I think I will kill him first. Then you and we will finish our wedding night." He shoved Lydia away from him, a brutal, contemptuous push that sent her sprawling onto the frozen dirt. He raised his pistol, aiming it at Elias's chest. "This is for coming on my land," he said. He fired. The shot was a deafening crack. Elias did not move. He had anticipated it. He had thrown himself sideways the instant Mercer's arm tensed, the instant he pushed Lydia clear. The bullet, meant for his heart, tore through the fleshy part of his left shoulder, spinning him around. He grunted, a sharp intake of breath. Lydia screamed. Mercer, his face contorted with rage at having missed, turned the gun toward her.
"You!"
It was the opening Elias needed. He was wounded, but he was alive. He launched himself off the porch, not as a man, but as an animal. He crashed into Mercer, a solid 200-pound impact that sent both men tumbling into the dirt. It was not a fight. It was a slaughter. Elias's rage, the rage of a lifetime, was unleashed. His fists, hard as rock, smashed into Mercer's face. He was not a scout. He was a Cheyenne warrior, and he was killing the man who had defiled his own. Mercer was strong, a big man, but he was a bully, not a fighter. He was scrambling, trying to get his gun, which had flown from his hand. Lydia saw it, gleaming in the firelight. Mercer saw it too. He shoved Elias off him and lunged for the pistol.
"Elias!"
Lydia screamed. Elias was faster. He rolled, drawing the knife from his boot. He did not lunge. He did not stab. He drove the long, heavy blade up under Mercer's ribs, a single, powerful, upward thrust. Mercer froze. He looked down, confused. He looked at Elias, who was still on the ground, holding the hilt of the knife. He opened his mouth. A gout of blood, black in the firelight, spilled over his lips. He fell sideways and was still. The silence was absolute. The fire roared. The men were still shouting, far away. But here, in the yard, there was only the sound of Elias, gasping for breath. He pulled himself to his knees. He was bleeding from his shoulder. Lydia scrambled to him, her hands shaking. "Elias, you are hurt." Elias looked at the body of Clive Mercer, his face blank with shock. "It is done." Lydia stared at the dead man. The monster, the man who had owned her. He was just A body. He was nothing. The terror was gone, but it left nothing in its place, only a vast, cold emptiness. She began to shake. It started in her hands and spread, a violent, uncontrollable tremor.
"He is dead,"
she whispered. Elias got to his feet, pulling the knife free, wiping it on the dead man's coat. He looked at her. "Lydia."
"He is dead,"
she said again, her voice rising to a thin wail.
"You killed him. For me, the man at the outpost. He died for me. The men at the stagecoach, they died."
She backed away from him, her eyes wide with a new, different horror. I did not want anyone to die for me again. I did not want... Oh, God! Elias, what have we done?" He took a step toward her, his face softening.
"Lydia, he was..."
"Listen." A new sound, not the shouts of the ranch hands, the rhythmic, pounding hoofbeats of a dozen horses, coming hard, coming up the main road. The posse. "No," Elias whispered. They had been drawn by the fire, by the alarm bell. They were here. He grabbed her arm. His grip was fierce. "The horses, by the creek! Go, now!"
"No!"
Lydia clung to him. I will not leave you. We will fight." "You will die," he roared, shaking her, his face a mask of desperate, terrifying love. "They are not here for him. They are here for me. They will hang us both." He pulled her, dragging her into the shadows as the posse, 20 men strong, thundered into the yard. They saw the fire. They saw the body. "It is Crow, the murderer!" one shouted. A shot rang out, lead splintering the wall above their heads. Elias shoved Lydia behind the blacksmith's shop. "There is no time." He was bleeding badly, his shirt soaked. "You have to live. Do you hear me? Live!"
I cannot go without you."
She was sobbing, clinging to his coat. He grabbed her face, his bloody, grimy hands holding her head. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of goodbye. It was salt and smoke and blood. "I will find you." He lied. "I will delay them. Now run, run, Lydia. Live for me, please." He shoved her, hard, toward the darkness of the creek bed.
"Go!"
She stumbled, looked back, her heart tearing in two. He was standing there, his face a mask of agony. "Go!" he screamed. She turned, and she ran. She ran, her side screaming in protest, a new, sharp pain she had not realized was there. She ran, her sobs choking her, climbing the small rise toward the creek where they had left their horses. She heard the shouting behind her, a volley of gunfire, then the deep, single boom of Elias's Sharps rifle. Answering them. She found the horses. She hauled herself onto the saddle, her hands fumbling with the reins. She rode east, away from the ranch, away from the man she loved. She rode into the prairie night, the snow beginning to fall again, stinging her face like needles. Behind her, the gunfire continued. A dozen shots, then the single, powerful reply of the Sharps. Another volley, another boom. She rode for what felt like hours, the sounds growing fainter, fading behind her, until all she could hear was the wind and the pounding of her own heart. Then there was only the wind. The gunfire had stopped. She rode until the horse was exhausted, until the gray, false dawn lit the sky. She did not know where she was. She just knew she was alone. She stopped the horse on a rise, and she looked back. On the horizon, where Mercer's ranch had been, a single, thick column of black smoke rose into the morning sky. It was not the smoke of chimneys. It was the smoke of a funeral pyre. The entire ranch was burning. He was gone. The posse had taken him, or the fire had. He had stayed behind to delay them, and he was gone. He was dead. The strength that had held her up, the anger, the love, it all evaporated. She was empty. She slid from the horse, her legs buckling. She did not know how long she walked. She was just moving. Toward the river where they had camped, the river where he had almost smiled.
She found it, the cottonwood trees, bare and skeletal, the frozen bank.
She sank to her knees. Her side was on fire. She looked down. Her dress was dark, soaked. Mercer's wild shot. It had not been a graze. It was deep. She collapsed beside the frozen water, the place where he had taught her to be strong. The cold seeped into her, but it did not matter. Nothing mattered. Her blood, dark and hot, steamed as it dripped onto the ice.
Elias,
she whispered, her voice a broken thing. The wind snatched his name from her lips and carried it away. The first thing she knew was the smell. It was not the iron and ash smell of blood and gunpowder. It was the smell of dried herbs, clean lye soap, and stew. The second thing she knew was pain, a dull, hot, methodical throb in her side.
Lydia opened her eyes.
She was not on the frozen riverbank. She was not dead. She was in a small, warm room, lying on a simple rope bed with a thick quilt pulled up to her chin. The walls were chinked with moss and mud. Bunches of dried sage, yarrow, and lavender hung from the low rafters. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and a woman sat in a rocking chair beside it, knitting. The woman was older, her face a map of deep, kind wrinkles. She wore a simple gray dress and a white apron. She looked up as Lydia stirred, her knitting needles stopping.
"Ah, you are back with us,"
the woman said, her voice a low, comforting rumble.
"Do not try to move, child. You have been very, very sick."
"Where?" Lydia's voice was a dry croak. "You are in my cabin, north of the Sweetwater. My name is Martha. My husband, Silas. He was out checking his traps. He found you by the river, half frozen. He thought you were dead until he saw your breath plume." Lydia tried to sit up, and a sharp, fiery pain shot from her side, making her cry out.
"Easy,"
Martha said, setting her knitting aside and rising. She came over with a cup of water.
"You were shot. Bullet went clean through, thank the Lord, but it took a lot of you with it. And the cold almost finished the job."
She gently lifted Lydia's head, helping her sip the cool water. "You have been here. Let me see. 4 days, lost in the fever. You were calling for a man, Elias." Lydia's breath hitched. The memory, which the fever had mercifully blurred, came crashing back. The fire, the posse, the sound of the gunfire, and then the silence, the column of black smoke. He was dead. She turned her face away from the woman, her eyes squeezing shut. A single, hot tear rolled down her temple and into her hair. It was not a sob. It was a final, silent acknowledgement. He had told her to live, and she had, and he had died. The trade was complete.
"He is gone,"
Lydia whispered, the words tearing her throat. Martha looked at her, her eyes full of a wisdom that had seen too much. She did not offer false comfort. She did not say, "I am sure he is fine." She simply placed a rough, warm hand on Lydia's forehead. "Then you must heal," Martha said, her voice gentle but firm. "The dead are at peace, child. It is the living who have to carry on. And you are living." Days bled into a week. Lydia's wound began to heal. The red, angry edges of the hole in her side slowly faded, the skin knitting itself back together under Martha's poultices of yarrow and pine sap. Her physical strength returned in small, painful increments. First, she sat up. Then, she stood, leaning on the chair. Then, she took 3 steps to the window. But her soul did not heal. She was empty. It was a vast, cold, hollow space, exactly like the Montana sky. She felt nothing, not grief, not anger, not even fear. She had spent every ounce of her emotion in the flight, in the fight, and in that final, terrible run from the ranch. There was nothing left. She would sit by the small window for hours, staring out. The world outside was changing. The land was thawing. The iron-hard, snow-covered ground was softening. Patches of brown grass, wet and matted, appeared. The ice on the creek that ran past Martha's cabin was breaking up, the sound of it a low, grinding groan, followed by the clear, new sound of running water. The sun had a different quality, a thin, yellow warmth instead of a cold, white glare. The first hints of spring were coming. The world was deciding to live again. Lydia watched it all with a profound and heavy indifference. She felt out of step, a frozen thing in a thawing world. She had survived, but she had no idea why. She had no purpose. Mercer was dead. Elias was dead. Her old life was gone. Her new one had died before it could even begin. She was just a body that had been shot and was now healing, and she could not find a single reason to care. "You must eat," Martha would insist, pushing a bowl of broth into her hands. Lydia would eat, mechanically, without tasting. "You must walk," Silas would say, a quiet man with kind eyes, holding the door for her. Lydia would walk, her feet numb, her eyes on the ground, and she would feel nothing. She was a ghost, haunting the cabin of the people who had saved her. She knew she had to leave. She could not be a burden on them forever. But the thought of leaving, of walking into that new, thawing world, was terrifying. It required a will, a direction, and she had neither. One evening, she was standing on the small porch, wrapped in a quilt Martha had given her. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple into the low clouds. A Chinook wind, warm and smelling of damp earth, blew her hair across her face. A figure was coming up the path. It was not Silas. Silas was tall and lean. This figure was different. He was walking, but it was not a walk. It was a limp, a slow, agonizing, dragging limp. He was using a long stick as a crutch. He was bent, his shoulders hunched, as if every step was a fresh agony. Lydia's heart, that cold, dead stone in her chest, gave a single, painful lurch. It was a trick of the light, a phantom. Her mind, broken by grief, was playing tricks on her. It was a trapper or a lost rider. It was not him. It could not be him. The figure kept coming, closer, closer, out of the long shadows of the dusk and into the pale, fading light. He was thin, skeletal. His face was gaunt, covered in a black, ragged beard. His clothes were charred, ripped, stiff with old blood. His left arm was bound against his chest in a crude, filthy sling. But it was his face. She saw the scar. Lydia's hands flew to her mouth. The quilt dropped from her shoulders, pooling at her feet. She did not breathe. She could not move. It was a ghost come to fetch her. The figure stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. 10 feet away, he looked up at her. His eyes, those gray, steady eyes, were sunken in his head, bright with fever and a weariness so profound it was almost death. But they were his. He had tried to speak, but all that came out was a dry, rasping cough that shook his entire, broken frame. "Lydia," he finally breathed. She was down the steps. She did not remember moving. Her hands, which had been so lifeless for a week, were trembling, shaking so violently she could barely control them. She reached out, her fingers touching his face. He was real. He was not a ghost. He was solid. He was rough. His beard scraped her palm. He was hot, burning with fever, but he was alive. "Elias," she whispered, the name a prayer, an absolution, a question. He closed his eyes at her touch, a small, shuddering sigh escaping him, as if he had been walking for a year just to feel it. She did not cry. She was beyond tears. It was a raw, silent disbelief. Her hands moved over him, touching his face, his hair, his good shoulder, as if she were blind and trying to learn his shape. to confirm he was real.
How?
She finally managed, her voice a choked thing.
The fire,
He whispered, his voice cracking.
I set the house. The rest. It caught. The posse. They scattered. They were afraid.
Of being trapped.
Your arm. Broken. The shot. And I fell from the roof.
He had fought them, set the world on fire, and then he had walked. He had walked for days, wounded, broken, feverish. He had followed the river. He had come for her.
I told you,
he rasped, his eyes finding hers.
I would find you.
He swayed, his strength gone. He had made it. He had seen her, and now he was done. Lydia caught him as he fell, her own new, fragile strength barely enough to hold him.
Martha!
She screamed, her voice, silent for so long, tearing through the twilight.
Silas, help me! He is alive! He is here!
For 3 days, Elias was the one lost in the fever. Martha and Lydia did not sleep. They boiled water. They cleaned his wounds. The bullet to his shoulder had been a glancing blow, tearing the muscle. But his arm was badly broken from the fall. His body was a map of burns and bruises. He had bought her life, and he had paid for it with every ounce of his own strength. Lydia did not leave his side. She was no longer a ghost. She was a fury. She was a guardian. She held the cup to his cracked lips. She soaked the rags to cool his head. She held his hand when he thrashed, whispering to him, not of love, but of the river, of the fire she had built, of the world that was waiting. On the 4th morning, his fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear. He saw her, sitting by his bed, her face pale and exhausted, but her eyes were alive. He said nothing. He just reached out his good hand and laid it on hers. They stayed with Martha and Silas for another 2 weeks. They did not speak of what had happened. There were no grand speeches. There was no need. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full. It was the quiet of 2 people who had been to the end of the world and had, somehow, found each other again on the way back. When Elias could walk without the stick, he knew it was time. "I am done running," he told her one morning, as they stood by the creek, watching the last of the ice break apart. She just nodded. "I know." He was carrying something in his good hand. It was a heavy, rust-covered revolver, Mercer's gun. He had gone back for it, taken it from the dead man's hand before he set the fire.
"This is his," he said.
"No," Lydia said, her voice quiet.
"It is ours. It is the last piece."
They walked, together, to the place where Silas had found her, the place where her blood had stained the ice. The river was running fast now, clear and cold, washing the banks clean. They did not dig a grave. They built a cairn. They gathered stones, one by one, from the riverbed. Lydia, her side still aching, placed the first stone. Elias, his arm in a clean sling, placed the next. They worked in their shared, comfortable silence, building a small, solid monument. When it was high enough, Elias placed the revolver in the center. Lydia looked at it, the weapon that had been meant to kill her, the symbol of the man who had owned her. Then she took something from her own pocket. It was her wedding ring, the band of cold gold she had not been able to part with. She dropped it onto the gun. They placed the last heavy stones on top, sealing the 2 things away, a grave for their past. They stood there for a long time, the wind blowing, the river rushing past. Then Elias took her hand, and they walked back to the cabin. The next day, they said goodbye to Martha and Silas. Lydia tried to offer them money, the few coins she had, but they refused. "You paid us, child," Martha said, hugging her. "You brought him home, and you came back to yourself. That is payment enough." They rode to the nearest settlement, a small, dusty town that was not yet large enough to have a sheriff or a telegraph. Lydia walked into the general store. Elias waited outside, his hand, by instinct, resting on the pistol he still wore. She walked to the assayer's counter. She held out her hand. On her finger was the small, gold locket from her mother. "I cannot buy it, ma'am," the assayer said. "I am not asking you to buy it," Lydia said, her voice clear. "I am asking you to sell it for me." She had nothing left, no money, no name, no family, but she had the locket, and she had Elias. She sold her last tie to her old life, the locket her mother had given her, for $120. It was enough. They bought land. It was not good land. It was high, rocky, in the foothills, a place where no one else wanted to be. But it was theirs. It had a creek and a stand of pines and a view of the mountains that made you feel small, but also safe. They lived in a tent made of canvas and hope. Elias, his arm still healing, could not do much, but he could teach. He showed her how to set a snare, how to read the clouds, how to find the dry wood. He sat on a log, his face grim with the effort, and he showed her how to use a broadaxe. "You are strong enough," he said when she protested. "The strength is not in the arm. It is in the legs, in the swing." She cut the first tree for their cabin. Lydia bought a mule and seed. She broke the hard, rocky soil with a mattock, her hands blistering, then callousing, turning as tough as his. She planted beans and corn and potatoes. One morning, Elias was trying to dig a post hole with one hand, his face pale with frustration. He was trying to build the first fence post. Lydia walked over, took the heavy digger from him, and slammed it into the earth. "Let me," she said, not as a request. He watched her. He watched the muscles in her back and shoulders, strong and sure. He watched her work, her face set with determination, her hands sure on the wood. She was not the woman he had met in the snow. She was not a victim. She was his. He stepped beside her, and with his one good hand, he helped her guide the next strike. They built the first fence post together. The world did not forget them. As spring turned to summer, and their small, one-room cabin began to take shape, the world found them. A rider from a neighboring ranch, 10 miles down, stopped. He saw Elias, with his dark skin and his scarred face. He saw Lydia, young and strong, and wearing trousers. The whispers started. In town, when Lydia went for flour, the women would stop talking. They would pull their children close. She was the runaway bride, the one who had shamed her husband. Elias, when he went, fared worse. The men in the saloon would look at him, their eyes full of suspicion and hate. He was the half-breed killer, the man from the wanted posters. The fact that Mercer was dead and the bounty was gone did not matter. The name had stuck. They endured it in silence. They did not need the town. They had their land. They had their cabin. They had each other. Their life was not easy. It was hard. And it was real. At night, they would sit by the fire they had built, in the cabin they had raised, and eat the food she had grown. Sometimes they argued. They argued about the right way to patch the roof, or whether he was pushing his arm too hard. Their arguments were short and sharp and real. Sometimes, in the dark, they would just touch, a hand on an arm, a shoulder brushing another, a simple, grounding contact to confirm that this was not a dream, that they were both still here, still real, that they had survived. One night, the wind was howling. It was a true Montana wind, a wild, lonely sound that clawed at the new wooden shutters and screamed through the pines. It was the sound of the world trying to get in, the sound of the past. They sat by the fire. Elias was cleaning his rifle, his movements slow, his arm still stiff, but sure. Lydia was mending his shirt. The light played on his face, on the scar. She remembered the night he had almost smiled. He smiled more. Now, small, quiet smiles. Just for her. She set her mending aside. She went to him, kneeling on the rug in front of him. She took the rifle from his hands and set it aside. She took his hand, the rough, calloused one, and placed it on her cheek. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of a quiet, steady warmth that was more powerful than any fire.
Please,
She whispered, her voice so low he barely heard it over the wind.
don't stop.
He knew what she meant. It was not about pain. It was not about pleasure. It was about this, the cabin, the fire, the life they were building. One fence post, one hard-won day at a time. She was asking him to stay, to live, to not stop being. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. Outside, the Montana wind howled, a reminder of the vast, merciless wild. But in their small cabin, a stubborn warmth lingered, a fragile, hard-won, and very real kind of love that simply refused to die. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know what you thought in the comments, where you are listening from, and connect with fellow listeners. Do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.